Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
Chapter 10, Ananda, the Attendant. We're going to start by wrapping up the conversation Lama Mitchell and I were having before the podcast began, because we were discussing some of our experiences with learning and with teaching, and discussing some of the differences between being a practitioner and being a teacher, and also kind of discussing some of the generational changes that are happening, which I think is not unrelated to the content in this chapter, and about how there's always been some shifts in like that kind of view. And I don't think I ever realized until our conversation today how, because I always thought of myself as like very liberal, I guess, in a lot of senses compared to the previous generation of Western Dharma teachers or teachers teaching in the West. But I also realize in other aspects, I'm pretty conservative, like especially when it comes to the Vajrayana practices. And I think that comes from seeing how this generation, previous generation was kind of the first time that the doors were opened up for everyone to come in and do deity meditation practice, whether it was Chenrezig or Green Tara. Now it's things like Mahakala and even wrathful deities. Like people are just being invited to come in and participate. And that's not something that I would advocate for. And I think with any of these Vajrayana practices, I think it's especially important that people have a guide, a teacher who's helping them through the practice. And that's how I teach it. And that's what I would, from my perspective, that's what I would recommend. And I think that comes from the fact that Vajrayana practices are there's no like right answer. They throw you into a space where you're doing a lot of ritual, you're doing a lot of visualizing that comes down from teacher to student, and those things can differ. So you can ask, I mean, it's really Vajrayana where the whole like ask 10 lamas, get 10 different answers comes from. And I think like when we get into doing these kinds of practices, it's especially important that you have some experience and that you have a guide. And I think the reason for that is just because there's a whole lot of shiny things in Tibetan Buddhism. There's a whole lot of fascinating things that can get us hung up, and we can kind of spend a whole lifetime just diving into all these different deities and practices and stuff, and perhaps never even really get any Dharma done, any kind of personalized experience of Dharma. And that's kind of what we were just discussing. I'm sure we both have our own opinions, but I feel like we are similar in a lot of ways in this being in this newer generation of teachers.
Yeah, totally agree. I guess if I had to sum it up, I would say what we were observing was maybe being like liberal in some ways in terms of overall view of the Dharma and like maybe like lifestyle, that kind of thing. But maybe like I definitely consider myself kind of conservative in the way that I would unveil the content, you know, to people who come to my meditation group and like, you know, potentially presenting Vajrayana practice, like you were saying, even something like Chenrezig. I guess it's possible, you know, maybe we have to think like maybe we don't need to be that conservative. I don't know. It's probably healthy to at least think about that. But I think the place where it's coming from, I was just thinking when you were talking, for me, I think is largely knowing that there's just a kind of careful step-by-step way that it all needs to be approached, I think. And especially that's easy to see in retrospect, you know. I think if I went back, I would be even more inclined to just be satisfied with where I was at every point in the journey, you know, because there's nothing to be gained from rushing through stuff to get to the next thing.
Absolutely.
And so to go back to my point, I guess it's like, I just know that maybe, or I have the feeling, maybe I don't really know, but I feel like unless someone is really ready to approach it in that way, then it may just be more practical and more effective to just teach simple practices, and then maybe start to talk about some of the bigger underlying views about the whole thing. You know what I mean? Like, that's where I'm comfortable going there. We can talk about a little bit about the scope of these teachings, but like keep the practice kind of simple, unless you really want to take up the path, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's particularly with deity practice, you're visualizing yourself as the deity, and excuse me, you're visualizing yourself as the deity. And I think that if you haven't gotten to a point where you feel like a practitioner, like a genuine practitioner, not a great practitioner, but like someone who's actually engaged in the Dharma in this body, in your daily life, then I think it's a kind of a step too far to ask people to then also imagine like that experience is inseparable from Chenrezig. I think it's a much closer thing to say, you know what, I got a whole lot of work to do on the Dharma path, but as I go to work and I'm stuck in traffic and I'm waiting in a line somewhere, and all these different things that happen when you're embedded in our existence, in our culture, if you can have that sort of worldly experience and feel like, yes, I'm a practitioner, I'm working, I'm on the path. That's an easier jump to then imagine that as being inseparable from a deity like Chenrezig. I think it's a lot harder to like not have integrated practices at all into your worldview, and then also say, well, just imagine that's inseparable from Chenrezig. Like, I think in a way we're talking about the same thing. Like, you just need to recognize that like you have the potential and like you have the working materials. Like you can practice Dharma in any situation. I think whether you're visualizing as Chenrezig or not, that's the story. But I think it's a little harder when you haven't taken that first step of personalizing the teachings. And I'm recalling a teacher mentioning that like these things that have come down to us through the Tibetan culture, like we have to recognize that like they think differently. Like they were, I mean, I'm not talking about all Tibetans necessarily, but like people living in Tibet, it was particularly like 100 years ago or something, had these huge vistas. You know, they were living in mountains, like the biggest mountains in the world, and these giant valleys and just striking amounts of space, you know? And, and that was what this teacher brought up, you know, is this idea of like this spaciousness of like the Tibetan view, you know, and so I can see the idea that like, that's, you know, we have to understand that that's the context a lot of this is coming from, but it's harder to see and integrate another culture's experience when you're in your own culture's experience. And I think we're in a lot of ways the opposite. I mean, we have so much, most of us have so much around us, you know what I mean? Like I can see maybe, you know, 30 yards until there's another house here. So like there's so many things so close together, so much data, so many things to be done, so much information. Like we are like American modern Western culture is like a swipe culture. You know, I mean, if you just think about like Instagram and TikTok and what YouTube has become with the reels and stuff too, it's like, we're just like one thing, next thing, next thing, next thing. And like, I think that makes this whole idea of like all of the bells and whistles of Tibetan Buddhism like even more dangerous potentially in our culture, right? Because we can swipe through so many different deities and we can swipe through so many different concepts and ideas and like. But I mean, I think we have to realize the fact that like there are very different views. One is a very wide open, spacious view that could perhaps use more detail. You know, like more like detail and more things to grab onto. Whereas our culture is so inundated with stuff to grab onto that maybe we need more stuff to let go of.
Right. Yeah.
So it is, yeah, it is. It's one of those things too, where I wonder just about the mixed motivations of like why everybody is being invited to do these practices. And I wonder if is the driving motivation Dharma, or is the driving motivation to preserve some cultural artifact that is waning.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out over our
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting time. And I mean, pretty relevant for the content of this book too. I mean, and he wrote this like 10 years ago. So
Yeah. And I feel like one of his messages here, if I could just sum up, is like, know your audience.
yeah,
It's like a simple thing you get whenever you do public speaking in high school or something. It's like, just know your audience. Right. And I feel like in a lot of ways, like that hasn't happened enough.
Yeah, I agree. There are some cases, but yeah. I feel now, I mean, this, I have no real idea, but I feel like Mingyur Rinpoche's organization has really made some effort.
Yes.
To do that. Tergar, I guess, is what it's called, right?
Zonsha Ponlop, Landa Bodhi as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. Mm-hmm. Yep.
But maybe to seg into this chapter, like I fully believe that it's good to have balance and to have balanced opinions. And I know, I think you mentioned earlier when we were talking, like maybe it's good to not be as conservative as we kind of are. But I think that I feel because I feel like there's a lack of that conservative voice about this stuff, I kind of want to move to that end in order to balance things, so yeah. Whereas I might be more open, I feel like there's too much messaging around openness when there's a lack of messaging around care. And
yeah. And I was just thinking when you said that, I'm like, maybe, what I feel like the right word might be for it is prudent.
Yeah.
I feel like that kind of works a little bit better for me personally, just because like it's more like, like careful and prudent rather than conservative, because one aspect of it is, I guess, to kind of draw on like an idea from this book, right? One aspect of the consideration is that whole idea of making an appropriate statement. I feel like,
yes,
what is actually appropriate.
Call back to chapter 1.
Exactly. Yeah. So that has more to do with maybe a sense of being prudent, like careful, considerate about what's appropriate and what's actually necessary. And in some sense, I think we have to trust that maybe we do have to kind of trust that we know something about what's going to hit the mark, just by getting to know the people and then drawing on our experience. I mean, we can't just like totally dismiss our sense of what is the appropriate statement.
Yeah. Yeah. And other people may feel differently, and that's okay. But I hope it never comes off like I'm saying any other teacher is wrong or that nobody should do these things, because I want to make clear that's not what I'm saying. But I want people to be informed. I want people to know. And I do think there is a degree of inability for people to know what they're getting into until they're into it. So I think that is another thing that, I mean, you can't really know, but I want people to know that that's the case, that like you're getting into something potentially much bigger than you think. And there may be more commitments, particularly thinking of Vajrayana too. Like, I think I know there are a lot of times where people have said to me, like, I didn't realize like, what was going to be expected of me, when I started these practices. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, yeah. So let's dive in. So, I think this chapter really personifies maybe the two approaches to the Dharma that we've been discussing and that he discusses throughout the book in Ananda and Mahakassapa. Like, I feel like that's maybe his goal in this chapter, is to kind of give us two figures who embody these two approaches. And, and we'll get more into that. But I also noted that it raises what I think is an important question. Like, did the view of monastics as higher or more important than lay adherents arise because it was primarily that community that preserved and set the canon.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like they kind of wrote the history or set the history, and maybe they made it look like they were like the favored group of the Buddha. And I feel like a lot of the purpose of this book was to lift up everyday practitioners of Dharma and people just living in the world. So I'm going to read the epigraphs here. First one is from the Kanakatala Sutra. And Pasenadi says, "What is this mendicant's name?" Gautama says, "His name is Ananda, your majesty." And Pasenadi says, "He is joyful, Ananda indeed, and so he appears." So Ananda actually means joyful. And side note, I was in a band when I lived in Cleveland called Wash, and one of our songs was called Ananda. And the only lyric was Ananda, Sanskrit for joy.
Interesting.
So it's funny, this has kind of come back around.
I mean, how did you, so you were aware of him?
Not aware of Buddhism, but my guitar player who brought that idea in may well have been. Or maybe he didn't know about the Buddha story, but he just knew Ananda meant joy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And there's also there's some IPA called Ananda, right?
Oh, really? There may be.
I'm pretty sure. I forget the brewer. I'm pretty sure there is like an Ananda IPA brewed by somebody or other.
Oh. Well, I'll see maybe if I can find a recording of that song and maybe link it.
You know what? I think it's a place called Wiseacre Brewing. Anyway, I think they have an Ananda.
That's
IPA.
cool.
Yeah.
So then there's a couple of these epigraphs. So the second one is from the Indriya Samyutta. And this is Ananda speaking. He says, "The teacher's complexion is no longer pure and bright. His limbs are all flaccid and wrinkled. His body is stooped, and some alteration is seen in his faculties." And the last one is also Ananda from the Theragatha. And he says, "All directions are obscure. Nothing is clear to me anymore. With our good friend departed, it seems as if all is darkness." And I know you and I both mentioned how, like, there's just a lot of details in this chapter. So, like, it's I think we both kind of marked a lot of paragraphs or sentences that were interesting, and there's a lot of like threads of a story that has been being laid out for us that come together in this chapter. So I feel like this might be a little different this episode, just because there's so much that like we can't just read the whole chapter, and there's a lot of this that, you know, just feels like it's informational. So
yeah.
Anyway, to sum up the beginning here, Batchelor points out that the world described in the discourses and described in the Vinaya, the monastic rules, is a lot like today in many ways. He points out it's not some sort of magical place like is described in the Indian epics or later in the Mahayana Buddhist works. As an example, he describes King Pasenadi, one of our subjects from a previous chapter, and he describes him as an overweight and tragic man, internally conflicted, who struggles to cope with the challenges and threats to his power, and ends up dying ignominiously in exile after gorging himself on turnip leaves.
Gosh.
So the point being that the political reality at the time is not that different from today. And I'm going to read the second paragraph here. It says, "For the first time in the history of Indian literature, the texts of early Buddhism opened a window onto an unapologetically human world. Take the 21 householders and adherents who are said to have found fulfillment in the Tathagata, to have become seers of the deathless, and to go about having beheld the deathless. Out of these 21, only 4 are mentioned with any frequency in the discourses: Anathapindika, Chitta, Mahanama, and Jivaka, while 4 do not appear anywhere in the canon apart from this passage. Of those whom we have information, 7 were from Kosala, 4 from the Vajjian Confederacy, and 2 from Magadha, Anga, and Ukala. The last 2 countries are east of Magadha. In terms of their social positions, 8 were mendicants or financiers, 4 were chiefs or government officials, and 1 was a doctor. From this rare snapshot of a group of Gautama's principal lay followers, we can infer that his teaching attracted men from the emerging mercantile and ruling classes who were actively involved in establishing the new urban societies that were springing up in northeast India. For them, the Dharma was an eminently practical way of life that sustained their demanding work in the world. And because these 21 are so incongruous with the rest of the canon, Batchelor says it's most likely that they really did exist, because it's hard to see why they would have been invented later, because most of the canon gives an impression of what he calls a proto-monastic community of renunciants being Gautama's goal. Like, he set out to make this monastic community. So it would seem odd to like invent these 21 people who were householders who would also achieve the deathless. But as I mentioned, it was the later monastic communities who memorized and transmitted the discourses. So it would have been in their interest to try to craft the canon in a way to legitimize their own way of living and practicing.
Yeah. My only note for this section 1 was just to put LOL and observe that the lay followers of the Buddha, even at this time, were essentially like the suburban upper middle class.
Yeah, good point.
Like, hilarious, unchanging.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Very good point. And so Batchelor says he focused on the lives of the 5 people he did in this book to counterbalance the traditional emphasis on the revered arhants who supposedly abounded in Gautama's time. Batchelor says, the advantage of concentrating on such figures is that we are immediately exposed to the ambitions and anxieties being played out in a complex, precarious world, rather than confronted by the serene detachment of depersonalized saints. And first thing I just want to point out is I'm really appreciating Batchelor as an author. Like, there's a lot about his writing that I think is really cool. And there's some subtleties that I've been picking up on. Like, he always like introduces little ideas. Like this chapter, there's like the idea of the like angry elephant, and it comes up in a couple different like places. And it's just like, there's a neat little rhythm. It's not always the same thing, but I think he kind of purposely like introduces images or ideas that come back around. Another one is like the bursting into flames that happens a couple times in this chapter. And so I think he's just a beautiful author. And so the reason I say that here is because I like this phrase, confronted by the serene detachment of depersonalized saints. Like, I just think the verb confronted is a very interesting choice there that I like. But I think more broadly, there's a cultural context that is implicated here, in that, like, even if there is like a whole other country, whole other part of the world, whole other millennia, most of us are still far more likely to relate to the sinners than the saints.
Right. True.
And going on to explain a little more about I think it, how do I say it? Going on, Batchelor says that because of many highly specific similarities between 2 different sources on the Buddha's life, he says 2 textual traditions that had no contact with each other for hundreds of years and were separated by the entire length of the Indian subcontinent, we can infer it's likely that these accounts were based on historical events. So we have 2 different textual lineages that didn't come into contact for a long time, but they have very similar details. And one of the examples here is like how Mahanama dies. Like, and there's like a couple different versions. They're not exactly the same in the 2 traditions, but there's some very minor details that are the same. And it's kind of like hard to see why some of those minor details would be fabricated or how they would be fabricated. So that's a good indication that these are probably accurate historical records. And Batchelor says, far more plausible, it seems to me, is to take the common elements of the story as surviving fragments of an oral tradition that goes back to the time of Gautama himself. So we have a little insight into how Batchelor assesses potential accuracy in these texts.
Mm-hmm.
All right, part 2. I will read this paragraph introducing Ananda. It says, Ananda was the younger son of Suddhodana's brother Amitodana, making him a first cousin of both Gautama and Mahanama. His elder brother, Devadatta, was among the first group of Sakyan nobles to join the order of mendicates, but became, in Buddhist legend, the traitor and renegade who sought to usurp the Buddha's role. Since Ananda is said to have been born in the same year as Gautama's son Rahula, he would have been around 30 years younger than his cousin. If Devadatta was roughly the same age as Gautama, then Ananda would have been born to a younger wife, possibly a woman from Videha, making him Devadatta's half-brother. Ananda is the only major figure in the canon who belongs to that younger generation. He probably entered the order when he reached 20, the youngest permissible age. He was appointed as the Buddha's attendant 5 years later and remained in the post until Gautama died at the age of 80, when Ananda would have been 50. First thing that stands out to me there is you had to be 20 to join the order when the Buddha was alive. That's gone away in some countries. There are definitely, in the Tibetan tradition, I think you can be like 3 or 4 and become a monk. And I think there's a lot of teachers who are speaking out about that, even Tibetan teachers, even today, speaking out about how problematic that can be, you know?
Yeah.
Not just the taking children away from their families, but also like the potential stunting of growth or development. And so, I mean, I think you could tell I have an opinion about this, but it is like, it's funny. It was interesting to me to see, like, in the Buddha's day, you had to be 20 before you took monastic vows. But today, in at least a couple countries I know of, you know, you can be extremely young child and go take your vows, go off to the monastery.
Yeah, that's interesting to think. Seems reasonable to have it be an older age to me.
Yeah, for a number of reasons.
Yeah, right.
So then we have, we learn a little bit about Ananda's background with the Dharma. And there was a mendicant called Puna, who was Ananda's first teacher. And Ananda recounted this teaching from him. Puna said to him, "It is by clinging, Ananda, that I am occurs, not without clinging. And by clinging to what does I am occur? It is by clinging to forms, feelings, perceptions, inclinations, and consciousness that I am occurs, not without clinging. Suppose a vain young person would examine his face in a mirror or bowl filled with pure, clean water. He would look at it with clinging, not without clinging. Likewise, by clinging to form, feelings, perceptions, inclinations, and consciousness does I am occur, not without clinging." And Puna led Ananda basically through a contemplation of the bundles or the khandhas that we discussed in the experience chapter, through which Ananda said he made a breakthrough to the Dharma. And apparently the Buddha had many attendants in the time before Ananda, but none of them lasted very long. Batchelor says some of them did not obey his orders. Others simply found the role too demanding. In his mid-50s, Gautama declared that he was not well, that he was feeling his age, and that he was worn out from his duties as a teacher, Batchelor says. And so Moggallana and Shariputra asked Ananda to take the job. And after asking many others who refused the job. And Ananda finally accepts, but he says, just as it is difficult to approach a mighty 60-year-old elephant in the forest, strong with great curved tusks and deep-set chest, reveling in the fight when he is ready for the fray, so it is difficult to serve the teacher and attend to him. Gautama may have complained of weariness and age, but Ananda was under no illusion as to what would be involved in serving someone who still appeared to be full of vitality and urgency, and eager to engage with opposition and conflict to realize his goals. He does then finally accept the role, but he does so on 3 conditions, and they are that he would not have to share the Buddha's food or clothing, that he would not have to accompany him when he visited an adherent's house, and that he would have free and complete access to him. Why do you think you would want to not have to accompany him to an adherent's house?
Yeah.
Actually, a couple of these I'm not entirely sure about. I just made a note, like, discuss, because I don't think I understand like why he wouldn't want to share the Buddha's food, or maybe just time off. Like maybe he didn't want to go to their house so we could have some time off. Maybe. So I guess I didn't think about it too much, but at the end of that paragraph, it says that part of his concern was like to get criticism or backlash from people who envied his proximity. So like, I guess maybe I kind of just thought like the less that he could be seen in public situations, maybe the better. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, or like, okay, so then the last sentence of that paragraph is also just saying like, by insisting on these conditions, Ananda demonstrated that he was not interested in personal gain, but was motivated by his devotion to the Buddha. So it could be like if he was going to donors' houses, like he'd be getting stuff, So then like maybe the other monks or whoever might be jealous and just think he's in it for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Ananda was only 5 years into being a mendicant, and now he would be, as Batchelor says, the Buddha's personal assistant, butler, chief of staff, secretary, minder, fixer, and masseur all rolled into one. And it's important for us to note that the Buddha was a big deal at this point. He's not, Ananda's not coming in when this movement is new. He's coming in at the height of Gautama's power. And Batchelor speculates that Ananda may have been chosen because of his youth and as a counterbalancing influence to the older, more conservative generation. And Batchelor says that the Buddha wouldn't have considered Ananda as a successor, though, as he intended the Dharma alone to be his legacy. And we also learn here of Ananda's impressive skill of memory. Batchelor says he's someone who had acquired an encyclopedic knowledge of the Buddha's teaching and was able to communicate it clearly and sensitively.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting in there to just think about, like, I had never given much thought to what the day-to-day might be like for the Buddha's attendant,
Yeah.
Probably pretty busy.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I think that concern about like criticism and backstabbing and stuff was real.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this chapter to me was just kind of interesting little tidbits about these folks that you had heard so much about, but maybe never really thought about what their life might be like. And then obviously, as we'll get to, like kind of rethinking some of the typical stories that we hear. But one other interesting, like I just marked here, like interesting to hear, there's this little thing about how Shariputra was like kind of considered the community's foremost intellectual.
Yeah.
That's like at the very end of the section. So like just kind of interesting to hear about these little details of these two figures, Ananda and Shariputra. Like Ananda, the skills of memorization and like, clear speech and all this, and then Shariputra, the intellectual type guy. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I guess it's just also worth pointing out in general how important memorization and the oral transmission of the teachings has been throughout the entire history of Buddhism, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I was going to read just this one sentence where it says Ananda is known by all traditions for having recited from memory the entirety of the Buddha's discourses at the council convened in Rajagaha some months after Gautama's death.
Wow.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense if you're maybe my age, maybe not your age, but like what I mean is like I used to know all my friends' phone numbers. Like I used to have an ability to remember everybody's phone number that I cared about because I had to dial it, and that was the only way to know the phone numbers. And so, but I just in a matter of like 10 years, I've lost the ability to retain phone numbers. So it's not, I think, that hard to believe that there may have been a time where when needs were different and situations were different, people could memorize huge amounts of discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was on the tail end of those times myself.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, I can still remember a couple of my friends' like original cell phone numbers, you know?
Yeah. 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 I still remember Jordan and Franklin. If you guys are listening, those are the two phone numbers that I still remember. It's the only two. And my mom's phone number, of course. But
yeah. It's funny, man.
Well, part 3?
Yeah.
So part 3 begins when Gautama was 72 and Ananda was 42. The cohesion of the community was seriously threatened in Rajagaha. The person responsible was Ananda's older brother, Devadatta. As the Judas Iscariot figure of Buddhist legend, it is almost impossible to find an image of Devadatta in the canon as anything but a weak, conniving, self-serving villain. Yet during the 37 years before he proposed the Buddha's retirement in his own favor, he seems to have been held in high regard. A passage in the Udana includes Devadatta among 11 senior mendicants singled out by the Buddha as ones who have expelled states of evil, fare ever mindful, and have destroyed the fetters. Elsewhere, Sariputra recalls having spoken in praise of Devadatta as one of great psychic power and majesty. Given cousinship with Gautama, as well as his inclusion among the first group of Sakya nobles to join the community, Devadatta was probably in the Buddha's core group of senior disciples. The occasion that triggered the crisis was a public teaching at which the elderly king Bimbisara was present. Devadatta stands up, comes forward, bows respectfully, and says to Gautama, "Sir, you are old now. You have lived out the span of your life. May you now be content to dwell in ease here and now, and hand over the community of mendicants to me." But Gautama has no intention of handing over control of the community to anyone, and Gautama says, "Not even to Sariputra or Moggallana, let alone a lickspittle like you." Humiliated in the presence of the king, Devadatta leaves. So Batchelor speculates on why Devadatta would make the suggestion he did. And he does try to counterbalance the purely malevolent motivations normally assumed for Devadatta. Mm-hmm. But he does make the point that Gautama's response is swift and harsh. And what came to mind here for me was just wrathful activity and wrathful option of activity. We talk, I don't know that we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there's kind of 4 kinds of activity. Peaceful, enriching, magnetizing, and wrathful. And so wrathful in this case does not necessarily mean like angry, but I think of it as like decisive and, potentially destructive is another word sometimes used for that. And that can be a form of enlightened activity. And that's what's personified in some of the wrathful deities you hear about in Tibetan Buddhist practice, which, jumping back to the conservative viewpoint, don't get into those if you don't have a guide. No good thing can come out of you trying to Google wrathful deities. I don't think it's worth it.
Right. Yeah.
But I've told you what you can benefit from, which is sometimes enlightened beings act in ways that are decisive and destructive in order to accomplish noble goals.
Yeah. I mean, I did think it was kind of like aware that I'm going to say the word interesting 1 billion times.
Yeah, that's all right.
Recording. But anyway, it was interesting to think about Devadatta a little bit differently. You know, like this whole idea that, well, I guess for one, that the history of all this has been recorded by a relatively small group of individuals. And, you know, there could be, we don't know exactly where the truth lies in all this, but there could be, you know, whole ways that things went that we don't really know about. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking about, like, it says here in that next paragraph, he just talks about how Devadatta obviously had been part of the Buddha's entourage for quite a while, like 37 years, and that he was probably pretty aware of what the Buddha had been thinking about, like, you know, the whole, like, no successor thing, and that he might have just seen himself as a realist, I think is how he puts it here, and could have been sincere in his thoughts about the survival of the community and that sort of thing, and that, like, potentially other people, other followers may have seen him that way too. Like, it's easy to just think about all these people in a one-dimensional way, like he was just this terrible guy who was jealous of the Buddha. That's basically,
Yeah.
you know, how it gets summed up. But anyway, I guess we don't know. Like, the Buddha could have acted wrathfully and still known that he was being sincere. But that's just kind of how it had to be in his mind for the situation. I don't know.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. Is we don't know what the Buddha thought of him. We just know what the Buddha did. And we can, with some faith and confidence in the Buddha, we can trust that he did what he thought would be the best for the preservation of the Dharma, you know? Yeah, so there's a statement made throughout Rajagaha denouncing Devadatta and basically saying that nothing he says should be taken as sanctioned by the Buddha, the Dharma, or the community. And that statement splits the people of Rajagasha into camps for and against the Buddha's action. And Batchelor says the Buddha knows exactly what he wants and does not want to happen to his community after his death, and is willing to do whatever is necessary to realize that goal. His desires are in conflict with Devadatta's desires. He counters Devadatta with a public display of scorn, abuse, and humiliation, forcing his perceived adversary to retreat. This is not the Buddha of popular imagination, the serene, faintly smiling sage dwelling in the peace of nirvana. This is a fierce and uncompromising figure in full mighty elephant mode who will broach no dissent. So Devadatta comes back and proposes, like, another idea. Like, he says, "Sir, you speak frequently in praise of desiring little, of being contented. Would it not then be good if all mendicants for the rest of their lives remain as forest dwellers, who never settle in towns or villages, as beggars who subsist entirely from alms and refuse invitations to eat indoors, as wearers of discarded rags who take no cloth offered to them by householders, as people who sleep only at the feet of trees and accept no shelter, and as vegetarians who eat neither fish nor meat?" So Gautama basically leaves it up to the mendicants. He says mendicants can live where they want to live, get their food wherever they want to get their food, wear whatever they want to wear, whatever kind of robes they want to wear. And Batchelor says, in rejecting Devadatta's proposal, Gautama affirms the mendicants' freedom to choose their own lifestyle and refuses to place any further limits on their freedom to interact with society. Implicitly, he also rejects the idea that rules should be imposed on the basis of an abstract principle, such as contentment with little. They should emerge as a response to harmful deeds committed in concrete situations. I think that's a super important point here, that he rejects the idea that rules should be imposed on the basis of an abstract principle. But that's like, that's religion. I mean, I mean, I think that's an overly simplified sentence that I just said, but I think in a lot of ways, that's what religious edicts are these just like abstract principles that then people spent millennia fighting over. And I think the point is that the Buddha taught the middle way, which is inevitably a little tense and a little unclear and takes some work and some mindfulness and then some compassion. I mean, honestly, maybe the best argument for compassion is we're going to have to figure out how everything works in any given situation. And if we're not doing that with compassion, that's hard, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
So Devadatta then forms his own community at Gaya Head, where Buddha originally gave his On Fire discourse. And starting this new community causes a schism in the broader community, in Gautama's community of mendicants. And that is one of the 4 acts of immediate consequence. So it's as bad as killing a mother, killing a father, killing a Buddha, or drawing blood from a Buddha. And we're also introduced here to the political aspects of Devadatta's plan, and that he's been scheming with Prince Ajatasattu. Hey, remember him? He was the one who killed his dad. You know?
Right.
Starved his dad to death, King Bimbisara. So this is King Bimbisara's son, Prince Ajatasattu. And so Devadatta goes, he impresses Ajatasattu with some magic where he appears as a little baby on his lap with a girdle of snakes. And Ajatasattu is like, hey, great, you know, like, and so they agree on like a little crisscross plan. I guess it's not a crisscross, but they agree on like a little mutual plan where Devadatta is going to kill the Buddha so he can become the Buddha. I'm not sure that's how it works, but that's his plan. And Ajatasattu is going to kill his father, who we'll recall is also the father of Jivaka in Abhaya from the previous chapter on Jivaka. So, and then Devadatta, this is probably where you and I have probably heard the most about Devadatta, his attempts to kill the Buddha, which are like basically like cartoon methods of, you know, it's like Roadrunner and Coyote kind of stuff, trying to kill the Buddha and failing badly. And but Ajatasattu follows through and is effective in his side of it. He does imprison and starve King Bimbisara and take over control of the country.
Yeah.
But then we learn that there are actually several accounts of foreigners visiting this area half a century after the Buddha's death and noting that there were groups of people still following Devadatta's rules. So this seems to run contrary to the narrative in the canon, which treats Devadatta's revolt as like a short blip, and that he and his followers actually returned to the fold after some convincing. But it sounds like there's other people who showed up there hundreds of years later, and there were still people following Devadatta's order.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? It says 7 centuries after the Buddha's death.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite a while. And it did definitely, like, I definitely had the thought, like, was this the origin of, you know, some of the more conservative sentiments that we still have in Buddhism?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just so hard to know, you know, what's for sure true about all this. But I mean, the way Stephen Batchelor paints the Buddha, like he even says at some point in here, like he's pretty lax, you know, like laid back and lax with the rules and all this sort of stuff. Like, it makes you wonder, like, how much of obviously like what has now become Buddhism was just like the sentiments of other people. Probably a lot of it, but yeah,
it's interesting because we can't know, and this also I think highlights some of the earlier stuff about letting go of truth. You know, like we can't know the answers to what really happened. We can look at some clues about what might have happened, but I think that also just brings us back to the practice. Anything we want to find, we have to find within our own domain, like our own senses and our own experience, like that's where we find out how things are. Yeah, I think that also is another sort of middle way about all of this, is balancing the teachings, which we already know have a whole lot of different factors and motivations shaping them, with our own experience and finding some middle way there.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay if I just read the last paragraph of that
please.
section?
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's that expresses the idea that I just brought up pretty well. So he says, just to clarify all of it, he says, in other words, Devadatta's rebellion may not have been a dismal failure, but a resounding success. In standing up to Gautama in his lax ways, Devadatta appealed to those mendicants, possibly the majority, who saw the renunciant life as an uncompromising rejection of the world and its affairs. Scholars have argued that the canonical story of Devadatta that has come down to us was invented at a later date by a faction that sought to restore Gautama's authority.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty interesting.
It's amazing too, because I mean, there's part of my mind that just keeps going like, well, someone would have known if they did that. But like, we're talking about, I mean, even just the time it occurred to me, like 700 years after the Buddha, there were still people following David. That's 35 generations. You know, like how many generations have passed? Like, how would we know if somebody like slipped another chapter into something, you know, or changed a few words or dropped a sentence? Like, we would never know, you know?
No.
So part 4?
Yep, let's do it.
So part 4 starts, Devadatta's rebellion is but one instance of how Gautama's world started to fall apart as he approached the end of his life. The Buddha may have been spared the tragedy of being crucified early in his teaching career, but his last years were marked by a series of calamities both within and outside the community. They describe an extended passion of sorts that culminates in his death in a sal grove in Kusinara. We have already seen that the armies of Vidudaba annihilated his homeland of Sakya. His cousin Mahanama and his benefactor and friend King Pasenadi died, and he himself had to flee Sakya for Vasali, only to discover on his arrival that his former attendant Sunakata had denounced him to the Vajjan assembly. When he fled to Rajagaha, King Ajatasattu cynically used him as a sounding board for his war plans. During his stay in Rajagaha, his 2 main disciples, Sariputra and Moggallana, died within a short time of each other, leaving a void in the leadership of the community. And Batchelor says that this final period in the Buddha's life is recorded in great detail, especially in the Great Discourse on the Passing. And there's also a bit of the story throughout the rest of the canon. And when Buddha leaves Rajagaha for the last time to spend the reigns in a Vasali town called Baluva, he gets very sick. And luckily, he pulls through. But it does seem to prompt Ananda to ask for some clarity from the Buddha about what will happen with the community of mendicants when he is gone. And when Ananda asks, Gautama says, "But Ananda, what does the community of mendicants expect of me? I have taught the Dharma without making any distinction between inner and outer teachings. I have no teacher's fist in regard to doctrines. If there is someone who thinks I shall take charge of the community, or the community should refer to me, let him make some statement about it, but I do not think in these terms." And Batchelor goes on to say, with these words, Gautama appears to relinquish control of the movement to which he had dedicated the past 45 years of his life. From now on, the Dharma will have to suffice in regulating the affairs of the community. There is no secret teaching or instruction that he has held back to pass on to an anointed successor. He has completed his work. He has taught everything he deems important, and he seems indifferent to what will happen next. He has no doubt that someone is waiting in the wings, eager to take control of the community and have it do his bidding. And he knows, I think, at this point that his life's coming to an end. And it seems like, from the way Batchelor frames this, he spends the rest of his life really encouraging his followers to be independent. And as Batchelor says, independent of him and work things out for themselves. And another thing he says to Ananda is he says, therefore, Ananda, you should live as islands unto yourselves, being your own refuge, with no other refuge, with the Dharma as an island, with the Dharma as your refuge, with no other refuge. And Batchelor points out the seeming contradiction in here. He says, this famous last testament is succinct, but its meaning is complex. It seems to involve a contradiction. After declaring oneself to be one's sole refuge, Gautama claims the Dharma to be one's sole refuge. How can a person have two sole refuges? The sense of the passage turns on how one resolves this puzzle. I'm just going to read on.
Yeah.
He says, I take this statement to be the Buddha's final word on self-reliance, a core feature that distinguishes his Dharma from other doctrines of the day. The kind of self-reliance he advocates is in no way akin to naive self-interest, or unthinkingly putting the fulfillment of one's desires above all other considerations. His emphasis on self, atta, underlines the importance of becoming independent of others in the Dharma, which is a characteristic of stream entry. Such independence is not the freedom just to do what you want, but the freedom to lead a life framed by the ethos of the Dharma, where you respond to your own and others' suffering in a way that is not conditioned by reactivity. Gautama encourages a caring and careful life, founded on personal responsibility and autonomy, rather than on a set of rules or precepts to be applied irrespective of circumstance. The seemingly double character of refuge is thereby resolved into one. It is to be grounded in the Dharma, which you have integrated into your own life. And then we learn the texts say that Gautama headed to Kapilavatthu, headed off with his destination being Kapilavatthu, but Batchelor points out that he knew that Viruddhaba was in the process of attacking there. Plus, it would be an incredibly long journey for a man of his age and failing health. And later on, he points out that may not have actually been his actual destination. So while they're traveling, he instructs his listeners to adhere to four principles. They are noble ethics, noble meditation, noble understanding, and noble liberation. I don't know that I've ever heard these four principles, but it is, towards the end of his life, what the Buddha was telling his final group of supporters on the way to the place where he would die that they should uphold. After that, it says, as his life ebbs away, Gautama seems intent on identifying the key elements of the Dharma that free one from a life of meaningless repetition. So maybe that's what Batchelor thinks he meant, or the purpose of those four principles. But yeah. I mean, I think you can map these onto the four tasks, but I don't want to artificially do it. So I'm kind of curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I mean,
I think they're pretty clearly one you can attach to each of the tasks.
Yeah.
Understanding's obviously the first one.
Right.
Ethics is obviously the last one.
Right.
Liberation, I think, is beholding nirvana. And I think you could call letting go of reactivity and meditation.
True. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. I hadn't thought about that.
I don't know that was his intention, but it seems to me like that would make sense.
Well, I actually was going to just read this little part. It's just back a little bit from there, but there's a paragraph that starts with after urging independence. So, I really just liked, it's kind of like yet another different creative phrasing of the fourfold task. So this is Stephen Batchelor saying, after urging independence, Gautama poses a rhetorical question. How do you go about living as an island unto yourself with the Dharma you have integrated into your person as your sole refuge? Here, Ananda, he answers himself, a mendicant abides contemplating the body as body, clearly aware, mindful, having relinquished attachment to the world, and likewise with regard to feelings, mind, and ideas. So now Stephen Batchelor comes in and says, in other words, and then he gives another kind of phrasing of the fourfold task by saying, comprehend and embrace your existence, thereby undermining your habitual reactivity and opening yourself to the vision of nirvana, that non-reactive space whence you can respond freely in ways not determined by self-interest alone.
Mm.
I feel like it's just kind of a nice, like, poetic summary of the fourfold task.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because, like, I don't want to call it the Four Noble Truths ever again. Like, I just, whenever I find myself talking about it, I just say the fourfold task. You know, and when I was still staying at Karme Ling after the retreat, those first couple months of the pandemic too, I was asked to give a teaching for Columbus KTC, my first one, and I decided I would do it on the Four Noble Truths because I figured where else would you start, you know? So, and I used Lama Yeshe Jamso's book. I think it's called On the Four Noble Truths, and this was like the only place I had ever seen any verbs associated with the Four Noble Truths. And they're not the same ones that Batchelor uses here, but it really stuck with me. And I always teach what to do with each of those truths ever since then. But I always kind of wondered, like, why is no one else really talking about this? And I feel like there was something more to the teaching. And like Batchelor, I think, gave it to me. Like now I feel like, all right, this is practical, pragmatic, makes total sense. Doesn't even require, I don't think, any sort of religious anything, you know? And I just love that formulation of the fourfold task. I think that's what I'm always going to call it from here on out. So the crew is walking. The crew is making their way. They make it to a town called Pava in the home of a man named Chunda. And when they go for their midday meal here, this is where the famous story begins. Chunda had prepared a big feast for them, what sounds like a really nice feast. They had some sort of thing that translates as soft pig or soft pork, which we're not sure if it's pork for sure. It could have been truffles or something else, but it seems like a pork-related dish. And the Buddha asks Chunda to serve it only to him. And after he eats it, he tells Chunda to bury the leftovers in a pit. And I was just thinking, like, what if you did that at somebody's house? Okay. All right. Well, that was really good. Thank you. But could you bury the rest in your backyard in a hole in the ground? We shouldn't be laughing about this. But then he was... So he was attacked at that. The Buddha was then attacked by a severe sickness with bloody diarrhea. And so he says to Ananda, let's go to Kusinara. And
I can't help with that.
Did you hear Siri?
Yeah.
At least Siri wanted to help.
Yeah, true.
So he says to Ananda, let's go to Kusinara. And so Batchelor then introduces some doctor here who counters the standard line that the Buddha got food poisoning. And long story short, given the symptoms described, it was likely not food poisoning, and it was if you're curious, a mesenteric infarction, which is lethal. And so that's likely what struck the Buddha. And Batchelor says, when the group reaches Kusinara, about 10 miles from Pava, the exhausted Gautama asks Ananda to prepare a bed for him between two sal trees. He lies down on his right side with his head to the north and instructs Ananda on how to wrap his corpse, prepare his funeral pyre, and enshrine his remains in a stupa erected at a crossroads. Ananda goes to his lodging nearby, leans against a wall, and breaks down. On hearing his distress, Gautama summons him back to his side. Enough, he says, do not weep and wail. Have I not told you that all pleasant things are changeable, subject to separation, and become something else? So how could it be that I should not pass away? For a long time you have been in my presence, showing me kindness wholeheartedly. You have achieved much good, Make the effort, and in short time you will be free from the effluences. He turns to the other mendicants and praises Ananda as one who is pleasing to the sight of those who come into his presence, delights them when he talks about the Dharma, and disappoints them when he remains silent. Moving. So basically, Gautama is announcing he's about to die, and there are many supporters who want to bid him farewell, which could be evidence for another of Batchelor's arguments, which is that Kusinara was actually Buddha's intended destination all along, and he had a lot of supporters there. And so during these final hours of his life, because the Buddha announces when he's going to die, he says he's going to die in the fourth watch. During these final hours, he makes three important statements. The three statements are, this is like right towards the end of the chapter. The first one is that when he was asked by a renunciate whether the other teachers of the day have gained enlightenment, Gautama replies, "Enough, Subhata. Never mind whether all or none or some of them have gained enlightenment. In whatever dharma and discipline that the Noble Eightfold Path is not found, there you will not find any realized wanderers. Yet wherever the Noble Eightfold Path is found, there you will find realized wanderers." And Batchelor says Subhata provides Gautama with another opportunity to identify what is essential about his teaching. The answer is unambiguous. What constitutes the core of the Dharma is the cultivation of a comprehensive middle way that embraces the entirety of one's humanity. The core is not a simple subjective state of insight or enlightenment. The second statement he makes is to Ananda, and he says, "It may be that you will think the Buddha's instruction has ceased. Now we have no teacher. It should not be seen like this, Ananda. For what I have taught and explained to you as Dharma and discipline will, at my passing, be your teacher." And Batchelor says this equally unambiguous statement affirms that Gautama has no intention of appointing a successor to be the teacher of the community. He insists one last time that his Dharma and discipline will provide adequate direction for his followers. And before I go on to the third one, I just want to point out, it's not all the time, but I hear relatively frequently from students who are newer to the Dharma and our lineage in particular, about how sad they are that they never got to meet Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. And they don't usually say this, but it's some version of what do we do without having met, the great teacher?
Wow. Yeah.
And so I can sympathize, and I feel incredibly lucky that we did. But
yeah.
But I also think about this statement, and I also think about how I will never regret having met Rinpoche, but I will say that having a flesh and blood teacher, that embodies the Dharma, that is as inspiring and awakened as Rinpoche was, I don't know, I'm sure there's arguments for why that's, of course, a blessing. But it definitely also encourages thinking of the Dharma and enlightenment as separate. And I would say, I really want to believe what the Buddha said here, that the Dharma is him, that's the teacher. But I also really miss Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. And I want, I wish that I really, really believed what the Buddha said, because, deep down, I miss Rinpoche, and it's harder without Rinpoche here. And so in a way, I almost feel like there might be an upside to people who didn't actually get to meet Rinpoche or the Buddha, because they actually have exactly what the Buddha said was necessary,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To kind of tie all that together in a way, it made me think that I know Rinpoche was pretty fond of citing that quote from scripture. I don't really remember, or I don't know where it's from exactly, but it's the Buddha talking about how in the future, in degenerate times, he will appear in the form of the Dharma, literally written texts and teachings. And Rinpoche, I know I heard him cite that at least a handful of times in various teachings, like with regard to maybe exactly this kind of question. But like generally, I would say to like affirm and build people's confidence that they could interface directly with the Buddha through the Dharma. You know, I mean, he was like, I think it's safe to say he was a big believer in that. So I feel like that's something to keep in mind. I mean, and so maybe like just by extension, you know, we can have that same kind of faith that we're like meeting Rinpoche there as well. Like, you know, he can speak through the Dharma, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's definitely like, I think there's something really powerful in that actually, because, you know, it's easy to feel like I totally would understand feeling like missing out on meeting a great teacher. But I feel like at the same time, like there's something powerful in the yearning or the longing or that slightly melancholic feeling. It's like that's very, very close to devotion. It may be devotion itself, but just that feeling of like longing for the teacher, it's like it turns you toward them in a open way, you know, like when you're longing for something. And I kind of also feel like the broader point of recognizing that the Dharma is like it's your teacher appearing to you in a way. It's like somehow in all of that, it's not so far off to recognize that it's like, you know, the teacher's everywhere, basically. Like it's not actually just the Dharma is not just stuff in books, you know? I mean, the Dharma is life. So the teacher's kind of everywhere. And, you know, if we, I guess, turn toward that reality with the little bit of sadness that might come with missing our teacher or like longing for the teacher, I feel like that's just all of that's kind of a formula for success.
Yeah. Super well said. Yeah. I never thought about that yearning and that longing being so close to devotion. Well, obviously the Buddha thought it was important, and whether we're talking about Gautama or Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. And so the third point he makes here is Batchelor says, having discussed the way mendicants should address each other after his death, Gautama adds, if it wishes, the community may abolish the minor rules after my passing. Batchelor again, what he understands, therefore, as the basis of discipline, Vinaya, is not for practitioners to blindly follow every rule and precept that he formulated on a case-by-case basis during his lifetime. Instead, he hopes they will have the wisdom and maturity to pursue an ethics founded on the principles of his Dharma that responds and adapts to the changing conditions of the world. Just to finish the chapter, as with his injunction at Vesali to live like islands unto yourselves, here, too, Gautama emphasizes the importance of leading a life of self-reliance based on the ideas and values of the Dharma, rather than uncritically trusting in another person's enlightenment, uncritically obeying the authority of an appointed teacher, and uncritically adhering to a set of time-honored rules. Shortly after making these points, the Buddha utters his very last words. Well now, bhikkhus, I say to you, things fall apart. Tread the path with care. All right, part 5.
Let's do it.
So the next morning, Ananda makes arrangements for the cremation. They go to the grove where the Buddha's body is, and Batchelor says they honor his memory with dance and song and music, and they do so for 7 days. Sounds like it would have been pretty beautiful. And as the cremation is about to begin, we see the arrival of Mahakassapa. Mahakassapa pays respects. Mahakassapa pays his respects, and the funeral pyre spontaneously bursts into flame. Mahakassapa only gets any real attention in the canon after the passing of the Buddha. So this is it's not the first time we've heard of him in the canon, I think, but this is when he starts to become a main player. And what Batchelor says is, he says his arrival, Mahakappa's arrival at Kusinara, introduces an abrupt shift in register. We move from the rituals of the Malans who honor the memory of Gautama with song, dance, and music to find ourselves in the presence of a stern, intimidating ascetic who immediately imposes his authority on the proceedings. He seems to embody everything that Gautama warned against as he lay dying. Mahakassapa is regarded as, quote, chief among those who expound the ascetic practices, end quote. Does not hesitate to declare how enlightened he is and takes it for granted that he is the Buddha's appointed successor. He is the very antithesis of Ananda, but Ananda seems powerless to resist him. So there are, I guess, 13 volumes in the connected discourses with Kassapa that, according to Batchelor, paint a vivid and unapologetic portrait of the man. Long story short, he met the Buddha at a shrine when they were both traveling. He spent some time learning with the Buddha and then meditated for a week and said that final knowledge arose. At the next meeting, he offered, it's pretty impressive. At the next meeting, he offers to trade the Buddha his robes. So he had some nice robes, and he offers to trade for the Buddha's patchwork hempen rags. And this is the quote I was going to read. Taking this gesture, so after they swap robes, taking this gesture to be a symbol of transmission, Mahakassapa continues. He says, if one speaking rightly could say of anyone, he is a son of the teacher, born of his breast, born of his mouth, born of the Dharma, a receiver of worn-out hempen rag robes. It is of me that one could rightly say this. Then he praises his own attainments. By the destruction of the effluences, I feel like he's going to be like, by the destruction of the influences. By the destruction of the effluences, in this very life, I enter and dwell in the pure liberation of mind, realizing it for myself with direct knowledge. One might just as well think that a bull elephant 7 cubits high could be concealed by a palm leaf as think that my direct knowledge could be concealed. And I'm going to read because Batchelor's funny. He says that such a self-serving speech can coexist with Gautama's self-effacing last testament in Vasali again illustrates that the early canon is a patchwork stitched together from the narratives of various factions within the community who held conflicting views of what constituted the Dharma. The arrival of Mahakassapa at Kusinara marks the beginning of a protracted struggle to determine the nature of orthodoxy on the one hand and ecclesiastical authority on the other. That continues to exercise Buddhists of all schools to this day. So we have this quite self-confident Mahakassapa showing up, claiming authority. He suggests that there should be a council convened under the auspices of King Ajatasattu. Pretty good guy. He's the one who killed his dad. And was in favor of having Devadatta kill the Buddha. So right. he's the guy who's going to take care of the mendicants for this council. And many think that Ananda should be able to attend, even though he had not yet become an arhat. And Mahakassapa has a solution. We can make Ananda the water boy. So Ananda can come if he carries water for all of us. And what he says is the Venerable Ananda, the teacher's attendant, who stayed near his person and to whom the teacher delivered several discourses, had for these reasons been appointed to supply the assembly with water. If the assembly requires water, then the Venerable Ananda, having been appointed to the office of serving water, must supply it with water. It's the most words I've ever heard to explain water boy. By remaining silent, the gathered arhants accept the proposal. Batchelor says it is hard not to see this proposal as a way of humiliating Ananda by making him little more than a servant. I think it goes further than this. The episode is a critique not only of Ananda as a spiritual failure, but of all that he stands for. This and similar passages imply that Mahakassapa and his clique, like Devadatta before them, disapproved of what they regarded as Gautama's lax style of teaching and leadership. And he goes on to say how Mahakassapa was asked to teach several times, but by Gautama, and Mahakassapa always declined, basically saying like they're too rowdy, they can't be taught. So when Gautama was alive and he invited Kassapa to teach, Kassapa always kind of just knocked on the community and their behavior and declined. So when they do arrive in Rajagaha, Ajatasattu and Mahakassapa fawn all over each other, like saying how great they each are. Ajatasattu nearly passes out because of the sight of Kassapa, and Kassapa says how awesome Ajatasattu is. Ananda goes for a walking tour with some other mendicant students of his. I kind of wonder what happened on this walk. It was interesting. It was a quick little blip in the book, but like Ananda goes for a walk with some younger mendicants. And during the course of this walk, they decide to disrobe. They decide to give up their robes and return to being just adherents. And so when Ananda returns, Kassapa scolds him for this and calls him a boy. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but it's a big insult and it upsets people. And Batchelor kind of points out there's this real split happening in the community. And he points out that Ananda is drawing close those who are powerless, women and now young men. This could be an early manifestation of the ongoing tensions between liberal and conservative wings.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
So Batchelor says, I find it hard to see Mahakassapa as anything but an insufferable prig. Is prig the same as prick?
I think it must be. It must be like the British version.
Yeah. I find it hard to see Mahakassapa as anything but an insufferable prig. If an arhat who is supposedly liberated for any trace of greed, hatred, and egoistic delusion can behave in such a manner, what, we might ask, is gained by becoming an arhat? Yet these detailed passages have been preserved in the canon, implying that people in the past experienced no cognitive or moral dissonance in reading or hearing of Mahakassapa's conduct. The way he treated Ananda must have seemed appropriate and praiseworthy to them. Again, like knowing their audiences, like at that point, that was fine, Hey, we may be moving the same place in the US right now with the dialogue. Could be same dynamics playing out. It's okay to say mean things to people, push them around and...
Right. Yeah, I kind of had that thought.
And the people who are like powerless, like Ananda was looking out for him, but like not Mahakassapa,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Insufferable prig. There's a phrase that's going to pop into my head and I'm going to feel like I probably shouldn't be thinking it. So the discourse to Gopaka Moggallana, there's a story that here he recounts about some questions asked of Ananda by this merchant and another person in government. And they're basically asking like, I think the long story short, they're asking who's the refuge now. And eventually they get to a question where Ananda basically names 10 qualities that inspire confidence. So the question was, is there any mendicants whom you now honor, respect, revere, and venerate, and on whom you live in dependence? To this, Ananda unequivocally answers, yes, there is such a mendicant. When asked to explain what he means, Ananda enumerates the Buddha's list of 10 qualities that inspire confidence. These include being virtuous and following the rule, being learned in the doctrine, being content with little, and being able to enter into the 4 meditative absorptions at will, as well as abiding in the pure liberation of mind. He says, when these qualities are found in anyone among us, we honor, respect, revere, and venerate him, and live in dependence on him. While this list of criteria would not exclude Mahakassapa from being such a mendicant, it shifts the emphasis away from privileging one specific individual and places it on an impersonal set of moral and spiritual qualities that anyone can achieve. What one relies upon is not the person, but the Dharma that the person has internalized and embodies. And he goes on to say that such a mendicant can be a person one reveres, respects, and trusts, shows that Ananda's vision of Gautama's community is one of democratic equality. Such a mendicant is every man, every person. This book is written too recently for him to use man. Every person. If we extend this description from mendicants to adherents like Mahanama and Jivaka, who are said to be seers of the deathless, then householders would be included as well. In this community, the Dharma becomes manifest through individual human lives, irrespective of their rank or gender. Each person learns its significance by listening to, reflecting on, and practicing its teachings, and further, by forming relationships with and coming to know those who embody it. Herein lies the sense of true friendship, which Gautama said constituted the entirety of the spiritual life. Part 6.
Sounds good.
So as the time of the council grew near, Kassapa and his elders bully Ananda more. They make him confess mistakes that weren't really mistakes, including asking him why he didn't ask the Buddha for clarification on what he meant by the community may lay down the minor rules. And Kassapa suggests in the community a sense to just keep all the rules. So even though the Buddha said, if the community wants, we can let them go, Kassapa suggests, let's just keep them all. And Batchelor says about this, in adopting this resolution, the community endorses a rigid morality, allowing no possibility for either innovation or change. Even today, Buddhist monks adhere to a set of rules laid down on a case-by-case basis to address specific issues in North India 2,500 years ago. As I read that now, I can't think of anything less dharmic.
Right. Yeah.
Really. If we're being mindful and acting spontaneously from wisdom and compassion, why in the world would we be going with case-by-case situations from 2,500 years ago?
Right. Yeah.
So Ananda ultimately does confess to all these mistakes they accuse him of. And Batchelor says his capitulation is complete. But it raises the question, how does Ananda feel about this? And even though there is this strange shift in the canon here, there are 3 stanzas from the verses of the male elders that stand out as quite different and direct. And so these are 3 stanzas said by Ananda. He says, all directions are obscure. Nothing is clear to me anymore. With our good friend departed, it seems as if all is darkness. For one whose friend has passed away, whose teacher has gone forever, there is no friend that can compare with mindfulness of the body. They of old have passed away. The new men suit me not at all. Alone today this child does ponder, like nesting bird when rain does fall. And Batchelor says the candor of these verses is startling, and it's surprising that the editors of the canon did not suppress them. The new men who succeeded Gautama do not appear in a flattering light. Such moving and heartfelt words testify to the sense of abandonment and isolation that Ananda felt after his teacher's death. In keeping with Gautama's final testament at Vesali, Ananda turns away from dependence on people and devotes himself to living as an island, starting with the cultivation of mindful attention to his own body. It's also interesting to me how many times we keep coming back to that mindfulness of body theme throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
So then the night before the council, Ananda achieves awakening. He does it in the liminal space between standing and lying down, which is a really unique situation in the canon. So he does achieve the state of an arhat. And at the council, Kassapa invites him to sit in the lion seat and to recite all the discourses he knows. And after the council, there's little canonical detail. It's said that Ananda lived to be very old. And when he knew he was going to die, he decided to head to Vesali. People realized what was happening. So as he was crossing a river between Magadha and Vajja, in order to not disappoint either place for him not attaining an awakening there, he entered the contemplation on on fire and spontaneously burst into flames as he was between the two lands on this river, so that neither group would be disappointed. And that's the end of Ananda. And Batchelor closed this chapter by saying, Son Buddhists remember Ananda as the second patriarch of their lineage, who succeeded his nemesis Mahakassapa, who, as we saw, believed Gautama had appointed him as his successor when he was presented with the symbolic gift of Gautama's worn-out hempen robe. The Son tradition further maintains that Mahakassapa received a direct mind-to-mind transmission from the Buddha on Vulture's Peak when Gautama held up a flower and Mahakassapa smiled. This famous episode, however, is not recorded in the Pali or other early canonical sources. And that's the end of the chapter, which I think is interesting. Like, it took me a couple times reading that. I still don't know exactly what his point is, but I think what I hear is, like, I think he's talked about how much he appreciates the Son tradition. And then here, I think he says, like, yeah, I appreciate it, but they do some things that are weird too. If I had to just paraphrase, right.
Yeah.
Like, I kind of hear that as being like familiar. You know what I mean? Like, I think any lineage of Buddhism you would pick also does some potentially historically dubious things.
Right.
For various reasons.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
Oh, I don't think so, really.
All right. Well, next chapter's the last chapter.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
I did start reading, just this afternoon I started listening to that chapter, and we will get into karma and rebirth.
Okay.
I knew it was coming. Yeah. So, cool. Well, let's bid our listeners adieu.
See ya.
See you soon. Peace.